We interrupt our program to bring you a special broadcast. The German news agency Transocean said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. I repeat, the German news agency Transocean said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. There was no Allied confirmation. The German broadcast could be one which Allied leaders have expected would be made with the purpose of upsetting Patriot plans inside the conquered countries. This bulletin has come to you from the NBC newsroom in New York. We return you now to your regularly scheduled program. The invasion has begun. There is no Allied confirmation. The Associated Press recorded the broadcast which said the invasion had begun from the west, that the French port of Le Havre was being shelled. Le Havre lies 100 miles from the English port of Portsmouth and is 80 miles south of the English coastal town of New Haven. German naval forces off the coast are engaged in a battle with enemy landing craft, the broadcast said. The German news agency said the Allied invasion operations began with the landing of airborne troops in the area of the mouth of the Seine River. I repeat, however, that there is no Allied confirmation of this claim. We return you now to your regular scheduled broadcast. And now here's the bulletin that's just been handed me. As I said when I first went on the air a few minutes ago, the Associated Press says the Berlin radio broadcast tonight that the Allied invasion has begun, that our troops are landing at Le Havre, but there is still no Allied confirmation. This may be an enemy trick. There has been no Allied confirmation, I repeat. Now on with the news. King Victor Emmanuel has turned over his royal powers to his son, Prince Umberto. The Italian king thus kept the promise he made several months ago when he said he would step down when Rome was liberated. President Roosevelt, using the language of golf, has declared that the liberation of Rome makes it one up with two to go. In other words, the Allied job now is to take Berlin and Tokyo. The president said in this connection that a tough struggle lies ahead. He declared that the Germans had suffered some heavy blows, but not enough to knock them out of the war. RAF heavy bombers have sought out tonight to keep the Allied aerial offensive going past its 19th hour. Tonight's targets appear to be in France or the lowlands. Mosquito bombers at the same time have been reported raiding Germany. The Russians have thrown back more German attacks in fierce fighting at Iasi in Romania. Red Airmen also have winged 75 miles southeast of Iasi to batter Nazi supply trains and equipment. The Germans sent their electrically controlled midget tanks into the Iasi battle, but failed to gain. And here at home tonight, the House tonight deferred until tomorrow a vote on a resolution to extend to June 7th, 1945, the time limit for courts martial of Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short. That's the news of the moment. This is the NBC newsroom in New York. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
The German radio claims this morning that the Allied invasion of Europe has begun. There is no confirmation as yet from London, Washington, or any other Allied source. And if I may, at this early hour in the morning, recapitulate the invasion news as it has been transmitted to the NBC newsroom here in Washington so far by the Associated Press. The first invasion bulletin came from London, dated London, Tuesday, June 6th. A broadcast of the German Transocean Agency said today, the invasion began in the first hours of this morning. That is the original bulletin received regarding the invasion. And may I interpolate here to say that the German Transocean Agency is the official German news agency and obviously a Nazi propaganda agent. The second bulletin, which was received here in Washington at 12:43 a.m. Eastern Wartime, says this. London, Tuesday, June 6th. The German radio said today that German warships are battling enemy landing ships at Le Havre. There is no confirmation from Allied sources. And then a later bulletin received says this. London, Tuesday, June 6th. The German news agency, Transocean, said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. The German broadcast could be one which Allied leaders have expected would be made with the purpose of upsetting patriot plans inside the conquered country. Then add to that bulletin goes on, the Associated Press recorded the German Transocean broadcast, which said that the invasion had begun from the west and that the French port of Le Havre was being shelled. Now, as you know, Le Havre lies 100 miles from the English port of Portsmouth and is 80 miles south of the English coastal town of New Haven. German naval forces off the coast are being engaged in a battle with enemy landing craft, which would be Allied landing craft, of course, since this is a German broadcast. This broadcast was recorded in London shortly after 6:30 o'clock Tuesday morning. That is 12:30 a.m. Tuesday morning Eastern Wartime here in the United States. And the German agency said that Allied, quote, invasion operations, unquote, began with the landing of airborne troops in the area of the mouth of the Seine River in France. The Seine River empties into the Atlantic at Le Havre after winding northwestward through France from the capital at Paris. These reported landings, if true, could be an Allied feint of which Prime Minister Churchill had warned the Allied world to expect in advance of the main Allied invasion blow. The Germans have been predicting that the Allies would strike as soon as the Allied campaign in Italy showed good progress, as it has done with the liberation of Rome only yesterday. And as we know, the Allies have been battering the French Channel coast, of which Le Havre is a part, for months now as a prelude to the invasion. So far, ladies and gentlemen, all those bulletins which I have read to you come from the Associated Press from German Nazi sources. The only Allied statement we have at this hour in the morning says this. Washington. The War Department says it has no information on reports by the German radio that invasion operations have begun on the French Channel coast. May I repeat that statement? Washington. The War Department says it has no information on reports by the German radio that invasion operations have begun on the French Channel coast. Now, so far, as I pointed out, except that last bulletin from Washington, all this news is from Nazi sources. And this means, without doubt, one of three things. It may mean, first, that the Germans are merely fishing for information. The Nazis are jittery. They want to know the very worst way when this invasion is really going to come. And by putting out bulletins such as you have heard so far this evening from German sources, they may be trying to find out. The second possibility, of course, is this. In a speech not so long ago, Prime Minister Churchill was talking about the invasion. He said that when this invasion comes, there will be feints, dress rehearsals, and false alarms. Now, if these attacks are in progress, as the Germans report, these attacks, to quote the Prime Minister, could be only feints, dress rehearsals, or false alarms in advance of the real, main, concerted Allied invasion attempt. And the third possibility, of course, is that this really is the invasion and that the Germans have sent out the first word over their propaganda facility. But so far, The War Department here in Washington says it has no information. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the invasion news up to this moment. Keep tuned to your NBC stations, which are prepared to bring you the fullest official, authoritative news on the invasion. I return you now to the NBC newsroom in New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a report from NBC in Washington by Richard Harkness. We return you now to your regular program.
For 1 a.m. Eastern War Time this morning, BBC broadcast Allied High Command urgent instructions to people in Holland, advising them to that if they are living within 35 kilometers, about 18 miles of the coast, to leave their homes immediately, and also to keep off roads, railroads, and bridges. These instructions from BBC followed in less than an hour after a German broadcast announcing that Allied parachute troops had landed in France. That report is not yet confirmed by any Allied sources. These bulletins came to you from the NBC newsroom in New York.
We return you now to our regularly scheduled program.
Western Europe. Before I read them, let me point out that there is no Allied confirmation of these reports. Bulletin from London, Tuesday, June 6th. 3 German news agencies tonight passed word to the world that an Allied invasion of Western France had begun, with Allied parachute troops spilling out of the skies at dawn over the Normandy Peninsula. The German report said that seaborne forces had landed in the Le Havre area. There is no Allied confirmation. The Germans also said that Allied warships were furiously bombarding the big German-held French port of Le Havre at the mouth of the Seine River, 100 miles west of Paris. Berlin also said that German shock troops were hurled against Allied troops who were rushing ashore from landing barges. Le Havre, incidentally, lies 80 miles across the channel from the British coast. ANB, the German news agency, said Dunkirk and Calais, just across the channel from Britain, are now under attack by strong formations of Allied bombers. The German Transocean Agency said the long-expected invasion by the British and the Americans has begun. It began in the first hours of the morning of June 6th by the landing of parachute troops in the area of the mouth of the Seine. Allied headquarters, I repeat, remain silent. DNB agency said Le Havre is being violently bombarded at the present moment. That bulletin came out at 7 a.m. French time, 1 a.m. Eastern War Time. DNB went on to say German naval forces are engaged in fighting with enemy landing craft off the coast. Calais and Dunkirk, which Berlin said were under heavy air attack, are also important French ports along the invasion coast just 150 miles northeast of Le Havre. ANB added that no enemy landings have been made as yet at Calais and Dunkirk. That obviously is an indication that the Germans are expecting Allied assaults all along the French coast. And just a little while ago, London radio broadcast urgent instructions to the people of Holland. These instructions told the people of Holland living within 18 miles of the coast to leave their homes immediately and to keep off the roads, railroads, and bridges. Let me repeat that there is as yet no Allied confirmation of any of these Berlin reports. This is the NBC newsroom in New York.
We return you now to your regularly scheduled program. The National Broadcasting Company will continue its network service throughout the remainder of the night in view of the important, but so far unconfirmed reports from overseas. Now, for a report from NBC's observers in the nation's capital, we take you to Washington.
This is Richard Harkness in the NBC newsroom in Washington. The Germans are proclaiming this morning, without Allied confirmation, that the Allied invasion of Europe has begun. The Germans say that Allied airborne troops are parachuting down over France and that Allied naval forces are bombarding Le Havre, the French port across the channel from Britain. So far, ladies and gentlemen, the news is this. The first word of this invasion, if it is an invasion, came from the Nazis at 12:37 o'clock this morning, which is 6:37 a.m. in Great Britain. This word came flashing into the NBC newsroom from London. London, Tuesday, June 6th. The German news agency, Transocean, said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. Then, a few minutes later, the Nazi radio said this. that Allied warships that German warships are battling enemy landing ships at Le Havre. That German warships are battling enemy, which would be Allied landing ships at Le Havre. This German broadcast was recorded by the Associated Press in London and dispatched to this country. The broadcast added that Allied ships were bombarding the French city, which is just across the English Channel, some 80 miles from Great Britain. Still, there was and is no Allied confirmation of these reports. And at 12:58 o'clock this morning, this bit of news, completely negative, came from Washington. The bulletin said this: the War Department says it has no information on reports by the German radio that invasion operations have begun on the French Channel coast. And then, only a few minutes ago, Elmer Davis, director of the Office of War Information, rushed to his headquarters here in Washington this morning immediately after being notified of these German reports. Elmer Davis told the reporters, "We have no more information than you have. I'll stay here until I find out whether the story is true or not." And by 1:45 a.m. this morning, almost the entire public relations staff at the War Department had reported for duty in the big Pentagon building across the Potomac River in Virginia. Despite the fact of no Allied confirmation, only a few minutes later, there came a bulletin from London which seemed at least to indicate that activities of a military nature were underway across the Channel, coming quickly on the heels of our liberation of Rome, and so quickly too after President Roosevelt's address to the United States last night on our triumph in Italy. Shortly before 7 o'clock European time, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is an official British government branch, issued urgent instructions to the citizens of Holland in the strategic lowlands. The BBC advised all Hollanders living within 18 miles of the invasion coast to leave their homes immediately, to keep off the roads, to keep off the railroad lines, and to keep away from all bridges. And then, only a few minutes ago, another BBC broadcast recorded in New York warned residents of France that a new phase of the air war against the continent had begun, and told them to stand by for further instructions that would be dropped by leaflets from American and British planes. And still later, the official German news agency, DNV, came into the picture with the German version of the news this evening. DNV said that Allied airborne troops were being landed in the vicinity of the Seine River, which is in the neighborhood of Le Havre. Presumably, the Germans said, the task of these airborne troops was to take a number of airdromes on the continent of Europe. These troops, the Nazis went on, were parachuting down on the tip of the Normandy Peninsula. Now, that is the spot news on the invasion so far this evening. Only German claims with no confirmation whatsoever from any Allied force, either official or unofficial. And here in the studio with me in Washington this evening is my good friend and colleague, Morgan Beatty, NBC war analyst and Washington commentator. Mr. Beatty was in Britain during the preparations for the invasion, which still may be yet to come, and he is here this evening to discuss the aspects of the news as we have it so far. Here is Morgan Beatty.
Thank you, Dick. The important tangible information the Germans give us about the invasion. Local patrols backed by general support further back. Thus, the whole German problem along the Atlantic coast is to determine which attack from the Allies should be the real thing, so that their support forces can be called up to meet Allied attacks. If they fail in this piece of detective work, they'll find their main support forces wasting their time on empty coastal areas while Allied forces elsewhere make headway against very small protective garrisons. So, from the German point of view, it doesn't matter whether invasion has actually started or not. They want to fish for all they can get in the way of information. In the background, of course, they have their own information as to our preparations, information which they're careful to keep away from us. In this situation, it's only natural that the Allied High Command is not going to put out reports about Allied activity, if any, at this time. The Allied job, in case we should attack in the Le Havre area, is to prevent the Germans from knowing where to bring their support forces, their reinforcements, for a coastal area, that is, a coastal area, in fact, lightly held except for guns. It's noteworthy at this point that the Germans discovered the Dieppe raiders
through their naval patrols. They depend on those patrols to signal the first Allied activities that depart from the normal. It's on the report of these patrols that their support forces further back must be called up. The German army, the main army defending that part of France behind Le Havre and similar coastal areas in that area, is probably based 20 to 40 miles back of the Atlantic. It's probable that the German left flank is based on Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic and their right flank in this zone on the Meuse River in Belgium. Between these two points, some 300 miles, the line runs along the Sarthe River to the Seine, north of Paris, then into Belgium along the Oise River. The Germans, by their reports to date, clearly indicate that they expect the Allies are trying to flush their defenses in this general line, that we are aiming either at Brittany or Normandy or Le Havre itself, the port for Paris. The most interesting phase of all these German bulletins we have been reporting to you is that the Allies have nothing to say anywhere, either in London or in Washington. So far as the Allied High Command is concerned, at this point, this is just another night.
You have just heard Richard Harkness and Morgan Beatty speaking from the NBC newsroom in Washington, bringing you a summary of the latest developments in the Germans' claim that invasion of Europe has started. Mr. Harkness and Mr. Beatty, along with other members of NBC's news staffs in Washington and New York, will continue throughout the night to keep our listeners informed of any later developments. We return you now to New York.
The National Broadcasting Company continues its coverage of these important but so far unconfirmed reports from overseas with Robert St. John speaking from the NBC newsroom in New York.
Here is one bulletin from London which we can all believe. Londoners were awakened in the early hours of this morning by the roar of planes. Londoners and the people on the coast of England saw the largest force of bombers and fighters ever to take the air. Fighters and bombers sailing away across the Channel. The latest Berlin broadcast is one which reveals the diabolical humor of the Nazis. It was the following brief announcement in English. This is D-Day. We shall now bring music for the Allied invasion forces. Diabolical humor. Now here's a little background to these German claims of Allied landings in France. For weeks now, the Allied Supreme Command has been warning French patriots to be on their guard, to be ready. The Patriot underground legions of France have actually been ordered to stand by for a flash which would send them against the Germans as skillful saboteurs and Allied intelligence agents. The biggest military armadas in history have been gathered in British ports for months and months. Huge stockpiles of equipment and vast concentrations of men, Americans, Britons, Canadians, Poles, Dutch, and many other nationalities, have been centered in British invasion bases. Allied broadcasts have warned for months past that the Germans might put out a false announcement of Allied invasion operations in an effort to bring Patriot French forces out into the open for annihilation. There's also the possibility that if the announcement is true, it is still only a diversion or a large-scale raid. The Allies have been planning invasion since soon after the British routed Dunkirk 4 years ago. The Tehran Conference with President Roosevelt, Mr. Churchill, and Premier Stalin also declared that the Allies would launch an invasion from the west. The Germans have picked two ace commanders, Field Marshals von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Rommel, to face the threatened Allied tide in the west. The Allies have not expected a major German counterblow to develop after any Allied invasion until several days after the initial Allied troops fight their way ashore. In an amphibious operation of such gigantic size and complexity, it's been expected that the Germans would hold their main forces in reserve until it was determined where the major Allied force would strike. The reported blow against the main Axis fortified western wall is a little more than 4 years after the British retreat from Dunkirk. Whether deception or not, the reported landing again set in motion Germany's bristling defense garrison. This port of Le Havre, which is talked about so much in the German claims, is one of the most important ports in all of France, in fact, in all of Europe. It has great dock areas which would be suitable for an Allied invasion once they were seized. Now, just to summarize, 3 German news agencies in the early hours of this morning last word to the world that an Allied invasion of western France had begun. That it had begun with Allied parachute troops spilling out of the skies just about dawn over the Normandy coast. The Germans also claim that seaborne forces landed in the Le Havre area. They also said that Allied warships were furiously bombarding the big German-held French port of Le Havre, which is just 100 miles west of Paris.
From the NBC newsroom in New York and in Washington, the National Broadcasting Company has brought its listeners a commentary on the German report of Allied landings in France. Commentaries by Robert St. John, Richard Harkness, and Morgan Beatty. The National Broadcasting Company will continue its network service throughout the remainder of the night in view of the important but so far unconfirmed reports from overseas. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
London radio has just issued a warning from the Supreme Allied Commander advising the French people to leave the entire coastline of France. And here's another bulletin, also from London, which says, the German military commentator, Captain Ludwig Sartorius, made the first comment on the reported invasion today. He said, the great contest between the Reich and the Anglo-Americans has begun. Reports that German warships are fighting Allied landing ships around the Seine estuary just 80 miles from the South England coast, and that Allied paratroopers are being landed in France. That bulletin comes from the United Press.
The National Broadcasting Company will continue its network service throughout the remainder of the night. There'll be a full 5-minute period of news at 2:55, so stay tuned to your NBC station for further details. We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
From the NBC newsroom in New York, we are bringing you coverage of tonight's announcement from German radio stations and news agencies, the announcement that the Allied forces are making landings on the continent of Europe. There have been no efforts on the part of the Allied command to confirm or to deny these reports. Because of the importance of keeping the nation informed on the developments of the night, the National Broadcasting Company will continue to give service to its nationwide network of stations for the remainder of the night. Ordinarily, this is the hour when our stations sign off for the evening. We will continue transmission over the entire network of NBC's 146 affiliated stations. And now for a summary of the news tonight, here is NBC's former overseas reporter and commentator, Robert St. John.
Before we go into the German reports, let me tell you all that London has said so far. Not long ago, London radio warned the French people to leave the coastline to a depth of 22 miles and to keep off the roads, to avoid crowds, and to keep in the country and in the woods. That broadcast followed, by just a short time, another broadcast to the people of Holland, in which they were warned that if they lived within 18 miles of the coast, they should leave their homes and keep off the roads and the railroads and bridges. And then, from London, comes a bulletin, which we can believe, a bulletin that Londoners were awakened in the early hours of this morning by the roar of planes. Londoners and the people on the coast of England saw the largest force of bombers and fighters ever to take the air, saw them sailing away across the Channel to Europe. And then here's a bulletin which says that Luxembourg radio has announced that Allied planes are over Germany. And now let's review what's happened so far. Shortly after midnight, 3 German news agencies began broadcasting reports that the Allies had started the invasion of northern France this morning. But, let me repeat, there is no confirmation of this from any Allied source so far. At this hour, it's impossible to know whether the enemy report is true or not. The first German report came shortly after midnight Eastern wartime. It told of German warships battling enemy landing barges at Le Havre, the French port at the mouth of the River Seine. This was followed quickly by a second German report that the invasion had begun with operations by Allied airborne troops and Allied ships around Le Havre. A series of bulletins from German sources then gave further alleged details. They said that Allied airborne troops were landing along the coast all the way from the mouth of the River Seine, where it empties into the English Channel, to the area of the Normandy Peninsula, which is approximately the Belgian coast. One German report said that Allied landings were being made in the area of the Somme River estuary, which is about midway along the French coast from the Seine mouth to the Belgian border. But let me emphasize that all this has been coming from the Germans. From the Allied side, there has been no announcement hinting at an invasion. One broadcast by the British told the French people that leaflets would be dropped warning them of which towns were to be raided, possibly 1 hour beforehand. The French were told that they would get all the instructions they needed from these leaflets. Strangely enough, while Berlin has been doing all this talking about invasion, insisting that this is D-Day, strangely enough, Paris radio has said nothing at all about this Allied invasion. Here's a bulletin from Washington which says the executive director of overseas broadcasting for OWI says, "We don't touch a thing unless and until it is announced officially." And nothing has been announced officially so far.
This report has come to you from Robert St. John in the NBC newsroom in New York. Ladies and gentlemen, the National Broadcasting Company is announcing to its stations over the country that the entire network will be kept open beyond our usual closing hour of 3 o'clock Eastern Wartime. We will continue broadcasting throughout the night. Stay tuned to your NBC station for complete coverage. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Berlin radio has just said that combined British-American landing operations against the western coast of Europe from the sea and air are stretching over the entire area between Cherbourg and Le Havre. Now that's a distance of about 60 miles, but remember, there is no Allied confirmation of this report. And here's another bulletin from London, United Press. The German DNB agency said today in a broadcast, which is unconfirmed from Allied sources, that 6 heavy warships and 20 destroyers are lying before the Seine estuary off the coast of France. I presume that they mean Allied warships and Allied destroyers. And now here's a bulletin, an Allied bulletin, giving us details of that broadcast made a little earlier in the morning by a spokesman for General Dwight D. Eisenhower. This spokesman told the people in the broadcast, the people living on Europe's invasion coast, that a new phase of the Allied air offensive has started, and he warned them to move inland to a depth of 35 kilometers, or about 22 miles. Now, listen to the interesting wording of this set of instructions. Quote, "A new phase of the air offensive has started. It will affect the entire coastal zone situated not less than 35 kilometers inland from the French coast. People will be advised by special announcements dropped from Allied planes. The attack will take place not less than 1 hour later. As soon as the warning has been given, the following orders are to be followed. First, leave the town at once. Second, choose such a route out of town as to avoid the main road. Third, leave on foot, only carrying essentials. Fourth, go to the country at least 2 kilometers from town. Do not assemble in groups which might appear to be troop concentrations." The broadcast then advised the people to keep as far as possible away from roads and railroad lines and to take nothing with them which they could not carry personally. The spokesman concluded this broadcast to the people of Europe living along the invasion coast with the advice that those able to leave the 35-kilometer coastal belt should do so at once, adding that those who cannot leave now must do so when the Allies give warning. This is a special bulletin brought to you from the NBC newsroom in New York. This is Robert St. John in the NBC newsroom in New York. Ladies and gentlemen, we may be approaching a fateful hour. All night long, bulletins have been pouring in from Berlin claiming that D-Day is here, claiming that the invasion of Western Europe has begun. Let me read you several of the latest bulletins. One says that a report, unconfirmed by Allied sources, of course, says that heavy fighting is taking place between the Germans and invasion forces on the Normandy Peninsula, about 31 miles southwest of Le Havre. Another bulletin, also from Berlin radio and unconfirmed, says that British-American landing operations against the western coast of Europe from the sea and from the air are stretching over the entire area between Cherbourg and Le Havre, a distance of about 60 miles. I repeat, there is no confirmation. And here's another bulletin just in. DNB, the German agency, says, this is unconfirmed, that the most important airdromes in the area of the Normandy Peninsula of France have been wiped out. Now, I presume that means wiped out by the Allies. As you may have heard on earlier broadcasts, all three German news agencies have begun broadcasting these stories that the invasion is here. But there is no Allied confirmation as yet. The first report came out shortly after midnight, and since then we've been flooded with reports from Berlin. Paris radio, strangely enough, has not confirmed any of these reports. And now we have just been informed that we can expect in a very few seconds, a very important broadcast from the British capital. And so now we take you to London.
The text of communique number 1 will be released to the press and radio of the United Nations in 10 seconds. Repeat, 10 seconds from now. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The communique will be repeated. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. This ends the reading of communique number 1 from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is New York, NBC Newsroom again. Men and women of the United States, this is a momentous hour in world history. This is the invasion of Hitler's Europe, the 0 hour of the Second Front. The men of General Dwight Eisenhower are leaving their landing barges, fighting their way up the beaches into the fortress of Nazi Europe. They are moving in from the sea to attack the enemy under a mammoth cloud of fighter planes, under a ceiling of screaming shells from Allied warships. The first news flashes do not say, but a large proportion of this assault is believed to be in the hands of American men. They are making the attack side by side with the British Tommies who were bombed and blasted out of Europe at Dunkirk. Now, at this hour, they are bombing and blasting their way back again. This is the European front, once again being established in fire and blood, not only by the Americans and British, but by many allies in the fight against Axis aggression. This is the supreme test of Allied spirit and of Allied weapons. The world's greatest military undertaking is underway. Casualties in this mammoth operation, in the subsequent drive inland, may reach a dreadful toll. The German war machine is still powerful and is still strongly entrenched. Our invasion forces are on the offensive against Nazi troops who have been ordered to die rather than retreat. However, die or retreat they must, for this attack up the shores of Europe is being made with all the strength the Allied command can throw into battle. Eisenhower, the commander, has promised that his men will bring victory in Europe in 1944. The first aim of the Americans and the British will be to secure their beachheads, and then the capture or building of airfields so that our planes from European bases can carry on the task of blasting loose the enemy from his prepared positions farther back. That task now is assigned to our planes flying out of England right now. And you have already heard the flash that came from London. The flash, the official Allied announcement that the invasion of Western Europe has begun, that D-Day is here, that H hour has struck. Air power paved the way for this mighty assault from the west. Nazi targets have been hammered day and night in an offensive which has steadily grown in destructive violence. Thousands of planes each day have flown cross-channel up from Italy and Africa to tear up German gun emplacements which have been 4 years in the making. Airfields have been knocked out of operation, and the German Air Force, with its wings very badly clipped, has been based farther and farther inland, closer and closer to the German homeland itself. And now, let me go on a little bit more. These Allied air blows were methodically driven home to prepare the way for amphibious assault.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, for a special broadcast, we take you to London, England.
Well, 10 seconds, stand by. 8 seconds. 5 seconds, stand by. 3, 2.
The following is the order of the day. This order was distributed to assault elements after their embarkation.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
I return you now to the United States.
Good morning, everybody. We have just had the first communique from General Eisenhower's headquarters on the invasion. Here is its text. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. And we have also had the first order of the day, the one issued by General Eisenhower, wishing Godspeed to his troops as they left the shores of Britain for the shores of northern France. He told them that they were about to embark on the great crusade. He reminded them that the eyes of the world are upon them, that the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere in the world are with you. He warned them that the task which they confront is not easy, that the enemy will fight savagely. And he urged upon them devotion to duty, perseverance in the task, and asked the blessing of God on the great enterprise that the liberty-loving peoples of the world have undertaken this morning. The attack is against northern France. That much we have known as a result of the German bulletins which have been pouring in upon us all morning. It is only natural that the Germans should report first, since they are the objects of our attack. since they naturally feel its force before we feel prepared to announce it to the world. But now it is official. We know that the long delay, the anxious days and weeks through which we have all passed are over. The great adventure has begun. The final chapter in the history of the Second World War is being written. Here is what the Germans have told us thus far about the invasion. Early this morning, and I am now quoting the German bulletin, numerous landing craft and light warships were observed in the area between the mouth of the Seine and the eastern coast of Normandy. That is the northern part of France. It is north of the Channel to some extent, south of the Channel for part of the way. Remember that Gravelines, Calais, Boulogne are just about halfway between fire.
5 seconds, stand by for a full broadcast. Here is the text of a report sent to London by Herbert M. Clark for the networks of the United States. This is Herbert M. Clark in a takeoff report from an Allied expeditionary base. I don't have to explain what the takeoff is. When you hear this, you'll know that Allied forces have leaped the gap between the bases in the United Kingdom and the coast of France. We'll be there, and we'll be there to stay as you listen. As I write this, we're in an unnamed port on an unnamed coast, one of the quirks of military security. But it's a funny thing about security. A week ago in London, I was in a state of constant irritation with security censorship. It was obvious from German radio reports that the Nazis knew things we knew but couldn't say. Since then, I've been living and eating and sleeping aboard the flagship of an Allied assault force, one of the several which are going to hit the Huns where he hurts most, and I find that Jerry knows less than he said he did. Since I've been here, we've had exactly one air alarm, and that not a raid or even a determined reconnaissance. And I also find that I don't object so much to security. My loyalty and responsibility to you back home is overridden by loyalty and responsibility to the soldiers on this boat and the sailors who are carrying them to the beachhead. That objective is also, for the moment, unidentifiable, because the place we've picked for our main landing is one Jerry hadn't figured on, and I don't want to be the one to tell him that our sector is the one where his counterattack should go. The Nazis have been badly outguessed on this whole show. He's going to be surprised by the direction of the attack, and he's going to get a shock by the timing. The master race has fallen down again. I'm treating all this in the past tense as though it had already happened. Maybe that's a mistake, but it's a reflection of the overwhelming confidence of the troops involved and the confidence I've drawn from the tremendous scale of the preparations. We haven't yet moved from our anchorage, but all morning this coastal strip has been full of movement. Ladies and gentlemen, I will digress to say that the next few sentences will the semi-numerous that the script has been censored. There are ships in the task forces which are striking, British, Canadian, and American. They range from big troop carriers and supply ships down to landing craft. Other vessels, landing craft, which make most of the journey, piggyback on bigger ships, are in the fleet. Now I admit that I can't conceive of a fleet of ships myself, but I do know that's as far as I can see from the bridge of this ship. Others are dotting the water thickly, and I can see about 30 square miles of water. Well, ships, I'm told, half the force. Double it, and you'll have the whole. And they're all loaded with fighting men and fighting weapons, some of them still secret. For some hours, the vanguard of our force assigned to deal with specific coastal objectives in our sector of Nazi Europe, and landing craft lumbering through a choppy sea so slowly that they must start well ahead of time to get to their assigned places at their appointed times. These ships have been moving out. I'm speaking to shore by the last available channel of communication. We'll be following those ships soon, and I hope to be back with you before long with some harder facts. This is Herbert Clark reporting from the flagship of an Allied assault invasion force for the networks of the United States. I return you now to the United States.
This is Robert St. John in the NBC newsroom in New York. An announcement has just been made by Supreme Allied Headquarters in London. It says, it is announced that General B.L. Montgomery is in command of the Army group carrying out the assault. that is, the assault on France. This army group includes British, Canadian, and American forces. Many of these troops, of course, storming the first barriers on the road to Rome, to Berlin, probably are American, Yanks from the farms of the Middle West, from the plains of the cow country, and from the streets of New York, and from the deep South. One estimate was that perhaps 70% of Eisenhower's invasion force would be American, with the British and the Canadians and the men of the other United Nations furnishing the balance. This estimate was based on the fact that Britain lacks the reserves in her home islands to send an equal number of men into the assault. Because the invasion of Europe is primarily an American invasion, it is commanded by Dwight Eisenhower of Kansas, with, as I just told you, British General Montgomery in command of the Army group carrying out the actual assault. At least 4 million Americans are on the fighting fronts overseas, and a large proportion of them have been concentrated in the British Isles. The vast movements overseas, which began a short time after Pearl Harbor, brought us into the war. Both here at home and along the coasts of England, American troops have been trained under actual battle conditions for D-Day, H-hour, which has now actually arrived. Recently, they completed a large-scale rehearsal for invasion over there in Britain. A rehearsal during which they went ashore with naval guns thundering overhead, with aerial bombs exploding in...
And once again, ladies and gentlemen, for a special report, we take you to London.
This is the last alerting announcement. In 10 seconds, the broadcast will be made from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
In a moment, we will hear the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. His statement will be followed by other messages to the peoples of the countries on the western coast of Europe, which are occupied by the enemy.
The Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
People of Western Europe. A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies. I have a message for all of you. Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own country, the hour of your liberation is approaching. All patriots, men and women, young and old, have a part to play in the achievement of final victory. To members of resistance movements, whether led by nationals or by outside leaders, I say, follow the instructions you have received. To patriots who are not members of organized resistance groups, LPOs, continue your patriot resistance, but do not needlessly endanger your lives. Wait until I give you the signal to rise and strike the enemy. The day will come when I shall need your united strength. Until that day, I call on you for the hard task of discipline and restraint. Citizens of France, I am proud to have again under my command the gallant forces of France. Fighting alongside their allies, they will play a worthy part in the liberation of their homeland. Because the initial landing has been made on the soil of your country, I will speak to you with even greater emphasis my message to the peoples of other occupied countries in Western Europe. Follow the instructions of your leaders. A premature uprising of all Frenchmen may prevent you from being of maximum help to your countries in a critical hour. Be patient. Prepare. As Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, there is imposed on me the duty and responsibility of taking all measures necessary to the prosecution of the war. Prompt and willing obedience to the orders that I shall issue is essential. Effective civil administration of France must be provided by Frenchmen. All persons must control in their present duties unless otherwise instructed. Those who have made common cause with the enemy and so betrayed their country will be ruined. When France is liberated from her oppressors, you yourselves will choose your representatives and the government under which you wish to live. In the course of this campaign for the final defeat of the enemy, you may sustain further loss and damage. Tragic though they may be, they are part of the price of victory. I assure you that I shall do all in my power to mitigate your hardship. I know that I can count on your steadfastness now, no less than in the past. For the heroic deeds of Frenchmen who have continued to struggle against the Nazis and their vicious satellites in France and throughout the French Empire have been an example and an inspiration to all of us. This landing is but the opening phase of the campaign of Western Europe. Great battles lie ahead. I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Keep your faith staunch. Our arms are resolute. Together we shall achieve victory.
You have just heard the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
You have been listening to a broadcast from London. During that broadcast, leaders of the refugee governments in London have been talking to their own people in Europe, talking to them just a few hours after the start of the Allied invasion. They have been giving them instructions on how to help the Allied armies, instructions against getting panicky, against crowding the roads, instructions to get away from the beaches as soon as possible. And while that broadcast was going on, bulletins have been coming in to our NBC newsroom here in New York.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we pause briefly for station identification.
Your station is WEAF, New York.
During the course of the last hour or so on these broadcasts that we've been hearing from London, you have heard a statement by General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of this great operation which has begun in the early hours of the morning. You have heard a statement in which General Eisenhower has addressed the people of Western Europe. In that statement, he said, a landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. He repeated that statement several times in the course of his statement. A landing was made this morning on the coast of France, and German radio stations admit that our troops are now 10 miles inside Europe. That apparently means, as I said a minute ago, that we have broken the first German defense line. We've pierced a hole in it. We are 10 miles inside the fortress of Europe, that wall of steel and concrete which Hitler boasted could never be broken. But it apparently has already been broken. And now, here is another statement by General Eisenhower, an order of the day to his soldiers, in which he told them that they are embarking on a great crusade. A crusade which he said must and will end in victory. The commander warned his men that they are facing a very tough and a very well-prepared enemy, but he told them that victory would be theirs. The victory they've been preparing for and working for and striving for so many months over there in England.
Now, for the first eyewitness report of action along the channel by NBC's own battle reporter, Wright Bryan, we again take you overseas.
This is Wright Bryan speaking from London. In the first hour of D-Day by British double summer time, or a little more than an hour before D-Day began by Greenwich Mean Time, the first spearhead of Allied forces for the liberation of Europe landed by parachute in northern France. In the navigator's dome in the flight deck of a C-47, I rode across the English Channel with the first group of planes from Troop Carrier Command to take our fighting men into Europe. Just before we left French soil for the return trip to England, I watched from the rear door of our plane, named the Snooty, as 17 American paratroopers, led by Lieutenant Colonel, jumped with their arms, ammunition, and equipment into German-occupied France. Our group, at the head of the leading wing from the U.S. 9th Air Force's Troop Carrier Command, was met with only scattering small arms fire from the fields, which were dark and quiet as we entered enemy territory. As we headed back towards the English coast, we saw tracers arching through the air behind us, a steady parade of Allied planes moving out over the course we had just navigated to strengthen the ground forces we had left below. In the channel below us, we could see a few ships, but could not be certain whether they were part of the Armada carrying Allied soldiers to the beaches for attacks which were quickly following the first landings of airborne troops which I had witnessed. For 2 days I had been living with the troop carrier squadron commanded by Major Clement G. Richardson of Salinas, California. His combat crews had been fully briefed as to their initial mission, the course they would fly, and all procedures they would follow. From the moment this briefing began, the combat crews lived apart from the ground personnel of their base, with barbed wire surrounding their quarters and guards protecting them from any contact with outside persons. All day Monday, they watched the weather. After an early supper, they broke up into small groups for volleyball games in their small recreation area. In the early evening, Major Richardson returned from a conference with Lieutenant Colonel Donaldson of Birmingham, Alabama, commanding this lead group. As Major Richardson came within the barbed wire enclosure of his own squadron, he blew a long, shrill blast on his whistle. The pilots, co-pilots, navigators, and radio men clustered around him. "Come into the briefing room," he said. There he stood in front of a large-scale map on which the course was plotted. As quickly as his men were all in the room, Major Richardson said, "Do you know your stuff?" There was no word of dissent spoken. Said Major Richardson, "Get your stuff and report to the operations room immediately. I'm going down to the colonel to get the weather report. I think this is it. Good luck." The crews began to file out of the room, but Major Richardson stopped them. "You want to get back, don't you?" he asked. There was a quick murmur of assent. "Then damn it, get in there and fight." The crews piled in their trucks to go first to the operations office and then to the line where their planes were drawn up and ready to go. As they moved towards the airport proper, they passed long columns of airborne troops, trudging slowly under their full loads of battle equipment from the bivouac area where they had been camped awaiting this day toward the planes which would carry them into battle. General Eisenhower had visited this camp during the afternoon, quietly passing among the men and chatting with them, asking them names and their homes and their jobs. Outside the door of each C-47, the soldiers assembled and checked their equipment, while ground crews and combat crews gave the planes a final tuning up. Heavily laden transport planes began taxiing along in long procession toward the runway. As the first squadron, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel David Daniel of Birmingham, Alabama, began to take off, the planes rushing in swift succession down the runway, Lieutenant General Lewis H. Barrington, the 9th Air Force commander, moved up and down the line of planes, giving the thumbs-up sign to his crews. Meantime, the paratroopers had adjusted their packs, donned their Mae Wests and chutes, and climbed into the planes. Each was so heavily loaded that he had to be pushed from behind and pulled from above to get up the steps into the plane. In our plane, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of San Antonio, Texas, the senior officer aboard, moved quietly up and down the passenger compartment, speaking to each man and asking if he had everything he needed. As the men settled in their bucket seats, Colonel Cole said, "The doc is going to give you some pills to guard against air sickness. Make yourselves as comfortable as you can. Better try to sleep a little." Quiet settled in the plane. These men had done their talking. Now they were grim and silent. The soldier sitting farthest forward on the port side, Private Robert C. Hillman of Manchester, Connecticut, said, "I know my chute's okay because my mother checked it. She worked in the Pioneer Parachute Company in our town, and her job is giving the final once-over to all chutes they manufacture." On the flight deck of our plane, the Snooty, Lieutenant John E. Peters of Chicago, the pilot, and Lieutenant B.E. Maxwell of Clay, Michigan, muttered soft curses as their motors were slow to start after a long pause on the taxi strip. But when the engines did turn over, they droned steadily and powerfully. Almost before we knew it, we were trundling along past the operations buildings and the control tower, where all the ground personnel of the base were standing. Some held thumbs up. Some made the V sign. Some waved. It was like the takeoff of a big mission from a bomber station, only more so. This was the first combat mission for this outfit, and everyone on the base knew that this was the day. Our ship was leading the second section of the second squadron in the first group. As we picked up speed on the long runway, I stood between the pilot and co-pilot and watched formation lights of the ships ahead of us slowly, almost imperceptibly climbing, then gradually swinging into wide circles. "This thing is really loaded down," said Pilot Pete. And as we became airborne, you could almost feel the sturdy transport strengthening its muscles and shouldering its burden. Then, foot by foot, almost inch by inch, rising above the fields and trees of southern England. As our squadron fell into its formation, 3 Vs of 3 ships each in the first section and 3 Vs of 3 ships each in the second section, which we were leading, the preceding squadron was already circling the home field, now gaining altitude more rapidly. Other squadrons followed us. Soon the entire group was in the air. All about us and below us was such a glimmering fabric of lights as I had not seen in the 8 months I had been in blacked-out England. 4 times we circled the field, its runways and perimeter outlined in sparkling white lights. Through the sky, formation lights of the planes strung out almost to the limit of vision, looking for all the world like holiday decorations stretching down the length of any American main street. As the long procession straightened out on its pre-established course toward the shore of the English Channel, signal lights blinked and navigators checked their speed and direction with the pilots and began their continuous plotting of position. As we headed toward the coast, the bulky transports silhouetted against the skies, they gently undulated in the prop wash of their companions. Reaching the first point for change of course, our plane blinked its signal light, and Pete said to his co-pilot, "Want to take it now, Maxie?" Maxie took over the controls. "Right on course, and we're 1 minute early," reported Navigator Robert E. Taylor of Altoona, Pennsylvania. At that moment, I left the glass blister in the forward roof of the fuselage, sometimes called the astral globe, sometimes called the navigating dome, from which I had been watching the formations about me, too fascinated to feel the weight of the flak suit which, like all crew members, I was wearing, or the steel helmet which I was pressing against the ceiling. Down the long passenger cabin, I walked to see how the paratroopers were riding. More than half of them had taken their colonel's advice and were dozing with their heads back against the wall and their feet stretched out in front of them. The others were sitting silently, except for 2 or 3 who talked among themselves in whispers. By the open rear door, Colonel Cole waited and said, "It's cold back here with the wind whipping in." I had been perspiring in the crew's cabin up front, but back where the colonel sat, I was glad I wore heavy clothing. 4 signal lights blinked as we crossed the coast of England and pushed out across the channel. The sea was calm, its steely grayness blending in the half-light with the dingier gray of the horizon. But soon the moon brightened the water and made the ripples below us twinkle. The ship on our wing, its heavy fuselage outlined against the water, but its wings obscured from my angle of vision, looked, but for the high tail fin, like a giant whale rising and falling in the easy swells. Halfway across the channel, planes one by one switched out their formation lights. "Where's all this fighter protection we were going to have?" muttered the pilot. We had not seen a plane outside our own formations, but the fighters must have done their work well, for there was no sign of enemy aircraft about. "Tiny, tell the colonel it's 30 minutes until jump time," yelled Pilot Pete. And the fat, husky crew chief, Staff Sergeant Richard A. Eberly of Indianapolis, whose father is a major in the Air Corps, shouldered his way back to give the word to Colonel Cole. And then, turning my eyes from the occasional lights and flares which glowed on the Channel Islands, I looked straight ahead and caught my first glimpse of the coast of France. I had never visited the continent of Europe in peacetime, and I was waiting for invasion day to visit it in wartime. The pilot and the co-pilot, too, were seeing this coast for the first time. None of us spoke, but each looked at the other. The navigation had been perfect. We could see the beach ahead of us precisely at the point we had studied it on maps, on aerial photographs, and on carefully modeled relief maps. The moon was almost full. Clouds were riding occasionally in front of it, but visibility was excellent. As our strong ship Snooty crossed above the breakers into the air of France, we plunged into a bank of cloud or fog and lost sight of the planes around us. For a matter of 2 or 3 minutes, we were flying formation on instruments. Then we emerged into clear moonlight. And below the rear door of the plane, almost close enough, it seemed, to step out without a parachute. Small fields looked peaceful with their orderly hedgerows. It almost seemed you could see the furrows. Now the paratroopers were on their feet, each adjusting his packs and snapping his ripcord over the static line, a cable which ran along the center of the cabin ceiling, so that each chute would open automatically as its wearer jumped through the door. "You all set?" asked the colonel. "Get this thing hooked for me," he said, as he took his own place closest to the door. The jump lights, a small bank of signal lamps, were gleaming beside the door. They blinked as the pilot threw his switch, and before I could look up, they began jumping. I wanted to know how long it would take the 18 men to jump. I tried to count 101, 102, 103 to estimate the number of seconds. Before I had counted to 10 seconds, may have been 11 or 12, but no more, our passengers had left us, all but one of them. The paratroopers shoved each other so swiftly and heavily towards the open door that they jolted against the door frame. One man among the last half dozen hit the rear of the door so heavily that he was thrown into the back of the cabin and dazed. The men behind shoved him aside and went on jumping. Before the unhappy soldier could get to his feet, our plane was well past the drop zone. In a matter of minutes, it was back over the water and setting a course for home. It was too late, and that soldier had to return with us. He was unconsolable. He thought his comrades might think him yellow. The plane crew assured him that they would think no such thing, but he sat moody and glum all the way back and appealed for lonely instructions when he returned. As soon as I had watched the jumps from the rear door, I ran back to the front of the ship and looked straight back from the glass dome. Tiny streams of tracer bullets were curving upward from the ground, but they were well behind us. One of the pilots in our squadron had unwittingly left on his formation lights, and the tracers came closest to his wingtips. But we saw nothing that looked like heavy ack-ack except in the far distance. Our course had been well plotted and navigated to avoid the known German batteries. We were over France only 11 minutes. With our ships lightened by unloading their cargo, we picked up speed and streaked for home. Behind us, we could still see the tracers and an occasional flare. Below, a few more ships, but we couldn't tell just what they were. The Battle of Europe had begun, and our squadron had delivered the first Allied foot soldiers to their scene of action. This is Wright Bryan in London, returning you to New York.
You have just been listening to NBC's war correspondent, Wright Bryan, the first man to come back from the invasion and make a report to America by air. Wright Bryan is from NBC's WSB in Atlanta, Georgia. He is also managing editor of the Atlanta Journal. Now here's a bulletin from Washington. Headquarters of the European Theater of Operations reports to the U.S. War Department that Allied aircraft covering the invasion are hitting any target which has any bearing on the strength of the armies at the front.
Ladies and gentlemen, the National Broadcasting Company has brought you the news to the moment. There'll be more news of vital importance to the world tonight, so stay tuned to your NBC station. Now, while we await further transmissions from overseas, we invite you to listen to the Star-Spangled Banner. Ladies and gentlemen, our national anthem.